Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our Female CSE Gang in Gang Environments ACT CIC Masterclass with Nikki Holmes. My name is Leah, and I am one of the hosts for this masterclass. And again, just for the purposes of the recording, this masterclass is a free masterclass being offered by ACT CIC, and it's actually one of the lessons for our students who are participating in our blended learning level 3 course in working with gangs and youth violence. So today is actually one of their lesson days. So we have some of the students from the course here with us today because this would be their regular class. And we've also invited members of the community in to be able to enjoy this masterclass with us as well. And this masterclasses are things that have been running for a little while now. This is one of the, I want to say this is maybe the 4th or 5th one that I've been participated in. So it adds to the learning of the students doing the full course. And it's also something that can just give people who are interested in the course or interested in learning more about gang impacted areas and serious youth violence an insight into one of the particular areas that, that we speak about. Thank you. So just quickly, so we have a level 3 blended learning course in working with gangs and youth violence. This is quite an in-depth course, and you can find out all about this course at actcic.org.uk, blended learning course, and we'll put the link to that in the chat so that you can see it. I'm one of the students of the course. I graduated of sorts last year, and so these are the steps that we have as part of the course. So as I said, today is one of the actual lessons, and we're actually in unit 3 at the moment, which is social factors. So the students of this course will go through 8 different modules. So they've already gone through youth marginalization and its impact, and that helps them understand how youth marginalization may impact the communities. We've also already gone through mental health and working with youth violence to understand the impact of mental ill health and trauma on working with young people in gangs. And right now we're on the unit called social factors that contribute to the development of violent youth and gang impacted environments. So we've already had 3 of the lessons, and now we're having this masterclass, and there'll be another lesson left in this, and then we'll be moving on to interpersonal communication skills, safer working, social psychological perspectives, national policy framework, and then exit strategies. So it is quite an intensive course, but you can be at any level to be able to access the course. You don't need to have any specific and definite, qualifications or levels of academic experience. If you have an interest in working in this environment and you want a qualification, if you're already working in this environment, because we already have social workers, people working with probation, we have youth workers, we already have lots of people who are already in the field. But if, like myself, you are nothing to do with the field, but this is something that you want to pursue, this is a brilliant course. The thing that's unique about this course is that we are actually the only organization that offers a accredited certificate and qualification in this course. And a lot of the alumni, a lot of the students who have come through this course, which has been run nearly 7 times now, have gone on to do great things in that field and in that work. And again, today we are going to be going through a masterclass. So we have with us Nikki Holmes. She's going to be talking to us about female CSE in gang environments. So today we're going to be looking at CSE, or child sexual exploitation, and child criminal exploitation in relation to both girls and boys in a gang environment, the terminologies used by young people to describe CSE and CCE, and the power of language, the psychology of victim blaming, referral, and signposting. So a bit about Nikki. This masterclass is being delivered by Nikki Holmes. She has served as a police officer. She's been a service manager for young person substance misuse services, as an experienced child services inspector for the CQC, and more recently launched her own community, Safer Together, that you can find at safertogether.co.uk, which is a proud member of the We Protect Global Alliance. And I'm sure she will be going more into her story and her introductions. So without further ado, Nikki, you ready to get started?
Yeah, thank you.
Lovely. Thank you for being here. And I'll go silent now.
Oh, thanks, Leah. And hi, everybody. It's always a real pleasure to be asked to provide any sort of input as part of this course, and also great to have the platform to speak to more of you that are not yet involved.
Sorry, Nikki, that is going. I'm going to try and find the switch off, because that doorbell going every time somebody enters is going to be truly annoying. So I'm going to try and switch it off. But yeah, if I don't find the off button, I apologize. Oh,
this is the future, isn't it? AI, AI at work. Thanks, Tez. But yeah, just lovely to see so many of you giving up time today to come along to this masterclass. I hope that you enjoy it. I hope that you find it insightful. Before I talk a little bit about me and the work that I do, and the interest that I have in this field and in this area, I think it's really important to say that this is your learning space today. So I think that we learn best through conversation, through discussion, through debate. So what I don't want is for me just to be going through a slide deck and me doing all of the talking. I'm really keen to hear from you as well. I always find that when it is discussion based, I always take lots away from it myself and lots of learning too. And it's all about continual learning, which is what this course is about as well, continual learning. Because in my experience working in this field as long as I have, learning is really important. The reason being is that exploitation, and I'd be interested in other people's views and thoughts, and all of those issues related to it, such as gang involvement, gang affiliation, gang association. It's a changing landscape. It's an issue that is constantly, continually evolving. I always describe working in this space and in this field as almost kind of like sand that shifts beneath your feet, because actually those that are exploiting children and young people, serious organised criminals, they're constantly changing their methods, their sophisticated grooming techniques. And sometimes actually they do so more swiftly than we as professionals do, because systems do not evolve and change at the same rate and pace. And that's why knowledge and learning is really key and really important. So as I say, brilliant to see so many of you here today. So as Leah said, my name is Nikki. My background is in policing. I was a police officer with West Midlands Police for a number of years. Had a number of different roles whilst I was in policing, and I ended my police career actually working within integrated offender management. And my specific role in that task force was supporting children and young people that had committed some quite significant offences. And often those offences and that offending was absolutely linked to gang involvement, gang affiliation and exploitation as well, which is really where I developed my particular interest in this field, interest that is just continuing to grow really. When I left the police, I went and worked in the field of substance misuse, and again, really developed my knowledge and understanding of exploitation and the links that exist between exploitation and substance misuse. Those links that we'll talk a little bit about today, links that I think are often overlooked and misunderstood. And then I went in and carried out a number of reviews nationally for the Care Quality Commission before establishing Safe Together, which is my own organisation. And we do lots of work, consultancy, training, independent research as well. So that's in a nutshell who I am, but I'm not going to bore you with who I am. I'm really keen to sort of get into the content. So I'm going to try and share the slides that I've got for you today, if I can. Let's try this previously. It completely threw me out, so hopefully it will work. There we go. So hopefully you can see the slides okay. Yeah, I can see a few thumbs up, a few nods. Brilliant. So today we're going to be talking about CSE in a gangs context. And I always am really pleased when Tez gives me a platform for this theme and this issue, because I think that we look at exploitation through a too narrow lens. And what I essentially mean by that is I still think that we are in the headspace of where we think that CSE is something that only happens to females. And as we go through the slides today, you will see that that's not the case. And we tend to think as well that criminal exploitation only impacts males. And again, that simply isn't the case. So the purpose of our time together today is to really widen the lens and recognise actually some of the nuance around the different typologies of exploitation and how actually we really need to actively challenge some of those misconceptions. The reason being is if we don't, and often we don't challenge the misconceptions because we don't have the knowledge base to do so, but if we don't challenge the misconceptions, what we tend to do is really overlook victims. So we might overlook females, for example, who have been groomed and coerced into gang networks, and also boys that also may feature within those gang networks and those gang profiles who may be also being sexually abused and exploited within that context. Again, their victim status is likely to be overlooked. So hopefully you'll find this a really useful discussion today and go away feeling really confident and empowered to change some of those challenge some of those misconceptions that you might come across. We're going to have a specific focus today as well on the roles that females play in gang networks. Often when we think about gangs and urban street gangs and the profile of those gangs, we have a real stereotypical view in terms of what those gang profiles look like and also the membership of those gang networks. Again, we typically tend to think of gang networks as being comprised of men, boys, and often we don't really think about the involvement of females and the various roles that girls and women can play within those gang networks. So we're going to spend some time looking at that today. So in terms of learning outcomes, really important to always have some learning outcomes so we can revisit them and make sure that actually you feel that you have learned what I hope you will do, is to explore awareness of child sexual exploitation in relation to both girls and boys in gang environments. So as I say, widen the lens, recognising that CSE, it isn't just limited to female victims. Also thinking about awareness of the terminology used by young people to describe child sexual exploitation and serious violence. And also ensuring that we know what the signs are to look for. What are the risk indicators of child sexual exploitation? And also widening that conversation so we also are starting to think about the signs of child criminal exploitation as well. Because child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation often go hand in hand. And as Lee has already mentioned, talking about the psychology of victim blaming. The reason being is what I find is that often what we do see is when children and young people have been victims of exploitation, whether that be criminal exploitation or sexual exploitation, there is still an element of victim blaming happening within community context, but also within professional practice. And so it's really important to understand why we victim blame, the harms associated with victim blame, and some of the psychological theory that underpins victim blaming too. And another key takeaway from today is thinking about the language that we use to talk about victims of exploitation. So the children and young people that we come across, that we work with, that have been victims of exploitation, and how actually we frame these issues and the language that we use can have a real direct impact on whether or not they will be framed as being complicit and responsible for what's happened to them, or actually whether or not they are perceived as being victims that are deserving of help, support and protection. And of course, we know that any child who's exploited, regardless of circumstances, can never ever consent to their exploitation. But the reality is that victim blaming is an issue, which means that some children are not being recognised as victims. And then really important, when we identify cases of exploitation or when we have concerns that exploitation is taking place, we need to just walk through what happens next in terms of referral and signposting to make sure that children who we're concerned about have that robust multi-agency safeguarding response in place. So what do we mean by child sexual exploitation? You might come across different definitions of exploitation. There are multiple definitions out there. The definition that we are going to focus on today is this one that's been offered by the NSPCC. And the NSPCC refers to child sexual exploitation, or CSE, as a form of sexual abuse. Now that's really important. Often when we think about a child who's been sexually abused, what's the first kind of scenario that enters our heads? What's our default position around that? What I find is often when we think about child sexual abuse, we think about abuse that's happened to younger children, children within the family environment, maybe perpetrated by either a family member or someone with close ties to their family network. Child sexual exploitation, however, is a form of sexual abuse that typically occurs beyond the family home. So it occurs beyond family units, often perpetrated by someone who has no links to that child's family, in locations, places and spaces that child has regular access to, but those spaces and locations beyond that child's family environment. As such, we sometimes think that child sexual exploitation is a lesser form of sexual abuse, or therefore is less significant and less harmful, and that is not the case. So a key takeaway from today is to remember that regardless of whether that child is sexually abused within the family environment by a family member or outside of the family environment by somebody who has no links to that family environment, it is still sexual abuse that we're talking about. And in the context of child sexual exploitation, it involves the manipulation and or the coercion of young people under the age of 18 into sexual activity in exchange for things such as money, gifts, accommodation, affection, or status. And I just want to focus a moment on this definition of child sexual abuse. Child sexual exploitation, which does highlight that child sexual exploitation is a form of child sexual abuse, which is helpful. But I just want to open this out to you. Is there anything about this definition of CSE that you think is unhelpful or perhaps confusing? No one ever wants to go first, do they?
Is it that it's just, it's the same as sexual abuse in general? It can still be in exchange for all of those things. So it kind of, yeah, it's just the same, really.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jade. And you touched on the word there, the word exchange. And I just want to unpick that because sometimes with definitions of exploitation, when you see the word exchange, the term exchange has been debated actually. So some people say, if you're saying that a child is actually almost trading sexual activity in exchange for things like money and gifts, is that not victim blaming? And I get that. I do get that argument and I do get that debate. My position on this is that we have to acknowledge the exchange. And the reason that we have to acknowledge the exchange is because by understanding that element of exchange, you know, that kind of element of what is the child in their head getting and gaining from the scenario and the situation, that helps us to identify unmet needs that are not being fulfilled in any other area or by any other means within their life. Now, that is really important because for me, if we can meet a child's need, that leaves them less vulnerable to exploitation. Because if we as professionals and practitioners or family members are not meeting a child's need, exploiters will do that. So it's important to note that a child can never consent to exploitation. They are never responsible for the abuse that they are being subjected to. But that element of exchange isn't about placing blame, onus, and responsibility on the child, but it is for us, a prompt for us to say, okay, let's put ourselves in that child's shoes. Let's display empathy for the child here, because actually what this person is saying to us is, well, he's helping me because he's giving me money, and that means now that I can buy things that I can't buy because actually I'm living in poverty, I'm living in economic deprivation. where actually, you know, the reason that I sleep with all of his friends is because he's given me a roof over my head, and if it wasn't for that, I'd be street homeless. So understanding that notion of exchange is really important to help us identify and then go on to address that unmet need. Does that sort of feel okay and make sense to everyone so far? Always happy as well for debate, by the way. I like healthy debate. So if there's anything that I say as we go through that you don't agree with, please let me know. I've gone rogue already. I was supposed to ask that question after I moved through the slides, so we're one step ahead. But I'll pause here and just ask the question again. What do you think about the element of exchange? Do you agree with my sort of position and stance on this, or have you got a different view?
I'll
I
just go on.
Oh.
I was waiting, just trying to give somebody the space before I jumped in. But carry on, go ahead.
I do think it makes sense, but at the same time, I do still think abuse is abuse, and there will always be some sort of, well, not always, but potentially there can be some sort of exchange of something for that child. I think sometimes it makes it seem as though, I know there needs to be a way to differentiate between kind of children that are being exploited, but it sometimes can sway towards a deserving and undeserving victim, and that's an issue that can come out of that kind of use of the term CSE in comparison to child sexual abuse. And children can be given those things even if there isn't a need. It still can be used as a way to coerce them, even if they don't necessarily they're not struggling financially, but it's just used as a way to entice them. So I think that's the issue with the concept.
It's a really interesting point you make there, Jade, and I absolutely agree, because I think that you've got, you know, kind of like a belief that actually if a child isn't economically deprived, if a child isn't being neglected, but actually, you know, they're being exploited and they are being given designer goods, they're being given large sums of money, that somehow they are less deserving as a victim, because actually that sort of need, in terms of that sort of immediate need, isn't there. But I would always push back on that as well, because I would say we need to think about the context in which children live in, right? So we live in a hugely commercialized society. Children now, you know, sort of like the digital world that they're navigating is a real complex space. You know, they're being completely bombarded by all these influencers that go on sort of these TV shows and get multi-million-pound contracts with the flashy cars, the designer goods, all of that. And so actually, for many children, that there's a need to kind of live a life similar to that because of commercialism and the world that we live in. So I think, you know, the point that you make about sort of the deserving and the undeserving victim is really important too. And I absolutely believe that because of things like victim blaming and the fact that we don't necessarily always truly understand the complexities of the world that young people are living in today, and all of the pressure that they're bombarded with all of the time, you know, the pressure of that commercialism, the backdrop of the cost of living crisis, that because of that we make assumptions about a child's real need. So I think that you raise a really important point there, Jade.
I was just going to read the comments. So we had Megan saying, oh, and a big comment just jumped in. Let me give me a second. Let me readjust. So Megan has said there's the exchange element. So I think that was just referring to when you posed the first question. And Jane has also said exchange hints at consent.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the dilemma. I don't know if Jane's one of our cohort students, if she wants to expound upon that for us, please, Jane, we'd appreciate it. and Megan's gone in detail here. I don't think we consider exchange as such in relation to other forms. If a child is sexually abused by a family member, we don't consider gains, and there is less victim blaming. It sits uncomfortable with me that there is a focus on exchange for extra familiar harm, but children may have unmet needs. So
yeah, no, really good points, really valid points. And I think that, you know, one key takeaway is that you all have it in your gift to make sure that when you hear the term exchange, when you see the term exchange, that you actually reframe that as that is not consent, because that point of exchange and consent is a really important point. Because I think that there's a lot of practitioners out there working in this space that have not got their heads around the fact that exchange is a different concept to consent. A child can never consent to their exploitation. So one of the first and the key takeaways from today is to really sort of push back on that. And remember that when we're talking about exchange, we're talking about unmet needs. That's really, really important. Okay, so CSE, spotting the signs. How do we know when children are being exploited? I think it's really, really difficult sometimes, because some of the signs and the symptoms of exploitation are also common signs and symptoms of adolescent behaviour. Things like mood swings, changes in like demeanour and disposition. You know, a child who suddenly becomes quite withdrawn, quite isolated, maybe changes their peer group, might not always be indicative of exploitation, but always something that we should consider. Also, the use of drugs and or alcohol. So drugs and alcohol, common levers in order to exploit a child. You know, it's not uncommon for a child who's criminally and sexually exploited to be given drugs and alcohol. And then also for that child then to be plunged in a situation of debt bondage. So what I mean is, I can think of a case that I was involved in a strategy meeting not too long ago, involved a female who's been sexually exploited. Someone who she thought was a boyfriend would describe their relationship as being consensual, supportive. He would give her cannabis, and then sort of a few months down the track, he would say, right, okay, so now you owe me X amount for the cannabis that I gave you. She was like, well, you're my boyfriend. You didn't say that it wasn't for free. And he was like, well, of course it isn't for free. I'm having to pay for it. And what he did is massively inflate the value of the cannabis that he gave her. And she panicked, couldn't tell parents, couldn't tell teachers. She was worried about getting into trouble for using cannabis. And actually then she was forced into a situation in this scenario where she had to pay back that drug debt. And one way that she was tasked to pay back that drug debt is by storing a firearm in her bedroom, which had huge consequences for her. So drugs and alcohol use, you know, I think around cannabis as well, I get on my soapbox about this. I think often we would rightly be concerned if we identified that a child was using Class A substances like crack cocaine, heroin, powder cocaine, for example. But then children who are using substances, there's almost a little bit of apathy around that. It's almost kind of like, well, most people of their age are using cannabis. We know that cannabis use is really prevalent. And I worry that we are in a situation where we are almost kind of veering into that territory of cannabis use in children and young people is socially acceptable. And I also think as well, you know, there's been a lot of marketing around cannabis oil, hemp, CBD, and there's a big misconception around actually cannabis being like a medicinal substance, something that's really positive, something that can boost productivity, alleviate pain. The reality is that street bought cannabis is massively problematic. It's often laced with other substances, synthetics as well. I remember when I was working in the substance misuse field, loads of children actually being admitted to their local A&E departments because they were smoking cannabis that had been laced with spice. So we need to be really cautious that we don't veer into that territory of professional apathy. What we know with county lines methods of drug supply as well, typically associated with the movement and the distribution of Class A drugs, so your heroin, your crack, but actually cannabis as well, increasingly so, because cannabis, the use is so prevalent that it's an additional sort of revenue stream. So we need to be actually mindful of the links as well between cannabis distribution and supply and county lines and criminal exploitation through county lines methods of drug supply as well. Be really interested in your views and thoughts about that. So I'll pause there and see if anyone's got any different or opposing views around the use of cannabis in young people. It's always a hot topic, I find.
Yeah, I mean, people call cannabis the gateway drug, but my concern is young adolescents using cannabis and the potential for mental health concerns, schizophrenia. I mean, it's not going to happen to all, but if there is an underlying history of schizophrenia within the family, that there is potential for it to be triggered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I worry that we're losing that kind of that point really, because we know that there's a growing body of evidence and research that highlights that link between mental health and cannabis misuse, particularly for young people that start to misuse cannabis before the age of 14 as well. But the other thing as well that worries me is sometimes that we don't even question why a young person is using cannabis. I don't think I've ever worked with a young person who's misusing cannabis just because they like it. Most of the time, they use cannabis because it's helping to really sort of self-medicate and really diminish some quite unpleasant symptoms of trauma. I know that a lot of young people that are maybe sort of waiting neurodevelopmental assessments, they often will use cannabis as a means of coping with some of their symptoms too. And I don't think that we routinely employ that professional inquiry, that professional curiosity as to, well, why are you using cannabis? Yeah. I think it is just that assumption that it's something that young people do. And actually, I would argue that in the majority of cases, there's a reason.
Yeah, there's another thought behind it as well. I mean, I remember back in the day when I was a young kid, I mean, the Rastas would smoke a lot of cannabis and whatever, and the makeup of the cannabis was, from what I'm told, a balanced makeup. So you'd have a balanced THC, balanced CBD. So you could potentially, there are, you mean, in America, there is used for, you mean, medical use, but because it's underground and it's grown underground, you get in THC heavy cannabis, which you mean it can cause significant mental health problems.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was about to say something very similar to Anthony in that sense, because I think, you know, I suppose there's a level of cultural acceptance, you know, particularly in certain communities, you know, heavily influenced, like I myself, when I was growing up, heavily influenced by, you know, the Rasta community. You know, many of my, you know, my godparents, uncles, parents even, you know, belong to that faith. And so, yeah, like I said, there's a level of normalization, but at the same time, we are talking about probably a radically different substance that we're referring to today than we are back then. So just the evolution of cannabis itself, and of course the controversial almost declassification, going into a Class C drug at one particular point, then back to now a Class B drug. So, you know, cannabis is you know, it's in a very unstable territory and ground, and lots of conflicting and conflating messages around that, which I think in some shape or form can, you know, influence you know, lots of young people, and again, a massive, especially when you're coming from you know, areas of massive deprivation and poverty, where you know, cannabis is almost normalized. It's part of normal growing up in everyday society. So yeah, that was my 2 pennies worth. But I'll come back to that. I think that was going back to the exchange argument, and Damien was just saying, yeah, mind-altering drug cannabis can be, as Anthony just referred to. Megan is saying, young people in our service often talk about experiencing sleeping issues, often linked to trauma, and using cannabis as they feel this helps them to sleep, but often ends up causing further issues. Is one. And then Damon's also saying it's altered now CBD in oil form, which the levels vary, and the levels of THC content for medical use.
Yeah, so for those of you that have never heard of like THC or CBD, I suppose it's useful just to sort of give a bit of context to that. So the CBD element that's found in cannabis naturally occurring is the bit that produces the pleasant symptoms, the relaxation, the pain relief. The THC is a psychoactive element. And if it's not sort of medical grade cannabis, it's carefully cultivated, then what you tend to have is cannabis that's really high in THC, which is the component that can trigger some nasty flashbacks, some mental health symptoms, and it's sort of like the really highly addictive element to cannabis as well. And something also to say is that, you know, the UK is an end user of drugs, which essentially means that nearly all of the substances that is in use and in circulation in this country are imported from overseas, with the exception of cannabis, actually. About 50% of cannabis that's in circulation across England and Wales is actually homegrown, cultivated here, often cultivated in properties that have been cuckooed, so properties that have been taken over and used as cannabis farms. In COVID, there was nightclubs because of the nighttime economy coming to an end that were actually being used for massive cannabis grows. And the 50% of cannabis that isn't cultivated here tends to come from overseas. A lot of it's sort of Dutch grown heavy skunk, which is really high in that THC, and kids are smoking it. So, you know, real sort of health harms associated with cannabis that's doing the rounds. So there is an absolutely sort of growing argument about the legalization of cannabis, so making sure that cannabis that can be bought legally is sort of safer, cannabis more medicinal, but who knows where we'll go with that in the non too distant future. And so going back to sort of spotting the signs of CSE, sexualized behavior as well, harmful sexual behavior, something that's talked about a lot. So that can be like sexualized language, you know, quite sort of sexualized behavior. And for younger children as well, that's not sort of close to that sort of transition into adulthood, that might be more sort of pronounced. We might kind of think, okay, so where have they learned that behavior from? It might not be exploitation, because actually if we think about younger adolescents and children often have access to digital devices, iPads, their own phone. And if you think about the content on TikTok and Snapchat, some of that is really sort of sexualized, harmful content that they might be mirroring and modeling. But again, really important when you see that, we see behavior that you think is not age appropriate, to have the confidence to actually explore where that behavior might have come from, because that can be a real indication of exploitation and abuse. Also sexting as well, you know, this is again really common. We see this happening increasingly commonly in schools. We do a lot of school-based work as an organisation. Teachers come to us all the time and say, I'm really concerned that it's normalised now to send self-generated nude or semi-nude images, or actually, you know, to be asking for images as well. So again, you know, we need to remember that when we're talking about exploitation, that often we have that stereotypical view of a child being exploited by someone who is significantly older, and that power imbalance playing out in terms of kind of disparity in age in that relationship. That is not always the case. What we see increasingly is children being exploited by children, and that adds an extra layer of complexity. So again, a key takeaway from this today is that it's not just about adults exploiting children, but actually peers exploiting their peers too. Another key indicator is sudden change in social group and peer group. We see this quite a lot. So where maybe a child is being exploited, their exploiters are actually trying to really sort of break down the links that they've got to their support systems, their family networks, their friendships, their existing peer groups, in order to sort of indoctrinate them into a gang affiliation, a gang network, or into a exploitation ring as well. So they become isolated from all protective factors and reliant on those individuals that are exploiting them as well. But of course, what we know in teenagers, I've got a teenager myself, is that their friendship groups shift and change all the time. So that can be a normal part of their development. But again, it's about being professionally curious. And what's really important is about peer mapping as well. It wasn't the plan to talk about that today, but I think it's important to raise the importance of peer mapping. And what I mean by that is really sort of having knowledge and understanding and awareness of a child's peer network. Who are those highly influential peer influences in their lives? And actually, are those relationships healthy and pro-social? Or are they actually formed in problematic environments and spaces? And do we have concerns about those links and relationships and those peer networks that they're part of? We talked a little bit already about isolation, but also becoming really secretive. Again, this can be part of normal sort of teenage behaviour. But if a child is becoming more withdrawn, is sometimes quite open normally and ordinarily, but then do become quite secretive, and if you sort of try to talk to them and they become sort of quite hostile, then it could be, again, a sign of exploitation. I'll pause there, just see if there's any kind of comment, anything that anybody wants to add at this point. I'll just check the chat too.
Sorry, Nikki, I'm back now.
That's all right, Ted. I was just checking the chat, see if there was
I was just seeing Jane, cannabis use in of the biggest grey areas in the youth work sector. Our relationships with young people are more informal than other professionals, but we're bound to the same safeguarding procedures. Are we to report every use of cannabis we know of? Where's the lines? As a sector, we should be raising the issue at a national level to National Youth Agency, NYA, for more training and clarity on this issue. Sorry, was multitasking. Got the message. Thank you, Jade.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point of raising this as a national issue is really, really important. I know the Children's Commissioner has got concerns about young person substance misuse and the fact that actually, you know, public health budgets have been slashed, and that means that provision specialist support services for young people who misuse substances, whether that be cannabis or anything else, are not always available. And typically what we see, I've just done a piece of review work in Wolverhampton, and you know, we kind of see how there are quite small numbers of young people that are receiving specialist support for substance misuse, even though cannabis use, substance misuse in young people is known to be really high. And that's not unique to Wolverhampton, by the way. That's that can be reflected everywhere nationally, certainly where I've been and worked in other areas. Often local areas don't have a young person substance misuse strategy, so it tends to be really adult centric, so it doesn't really kind of recognise the interface between substance misuse and exploitation.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a real distinct issue. I think we can't just bung it into the adults arena. But in terms of the question and the point that Jane raised about, do we report every single incident of cannabis use? I don't think there's the capacity to do that. And even if you did, service provision isn't there. But I think it's really important that where you've got children who are misusing substances, young people that are using cannabis, that in every single case we're professionally curious as to why, that we're just not accepting of it, that we ask those questions, that we know where we can signpost children to support services locally, and that we're persistent in trying to sort of address their substance misuse and support them to seek additional support. And if we've got any concerns about, you know, exploitation and abuse linked to their substance misuse, then of course, you know, your safeguarding procedures and arrangements would kick in there, as Jane's already sort of alluded to. So I think the main thing is about, in every case, we won't necessarily report every case, because also as well, children who misuse cannabis and are signposted to support services, a lot of drug services will only work with that child if they've given consent. So actually just sort of blanket signposting without doing any kind of work to understand that child's perspective, issues attached to their substance misuse, is just going to generate a lot of referrals to services where they've not consented to, and then they won't get the support anyway. So I think it's really important that within every case we're professionally curious first and foremost. That was a really waffly sort of response to the questions raised by Jane.
No, it was a good response. But if anybody else that you know, wants to kind of come back on that particular issue, or yourself, I think it was Jane that was asking, then go ahead and we'll see if we can explore it a little bit further. I think it's it's also like the convergence, isn't it? It's like when it crosses over with other issues, and then there's concerns around other issues also. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be challenging young people who, you know, we know to be, you know, engaging in substance misuse or alcohol. Again, you know, all the same. You know, again, we can have, and having that youth work background, I completely understand where Jane's kind of coming from. You know, many times even on outreach and detached youth work, and you know, we're in young people's spaces, and you know, for us to start waving fingers and telling them about themselves and their substance misuse might not be the best practice that's going to help us to build that relationship. But you know, I think one of the things that, you know, I certainly do with our team is kind of, you know, we kind of work out what's going to be acceptable versus what's not acceptable, and when to engage and when not to engage. So again, if young people are kind of engaging in substance misuse, then we probably just say, well, criminal activity, you know, we'll just have a policy of we won't engage with you at this particular stage, and try and maybe just a high and by and keep it moving and engage with you at a different time. But it is it's a very difficult balance when you're, you know, you're a youth worker and you're trying to engage in the world of young people in order to become that trusted adult, so you can have these conversations with them, which means that, you know, ultimately you might not be challenging them straight away, not until you have that relationship built with them in the first place.
It's all about that rapport building, isn't it? And I think non-judgment as well.
Yes.
Because actually, if you're sort of going in, as you say, finger wagging, you know, this is legal, you shouldn't be doing it, this is going to rot your brain, it's going to switch them off. But actually, you know, build that rapport, just dropping those questions about, I mean, for me, one of the biggest bugbears for me is when there's young people using cannabis and there's no exploration of how they're funding it.
Yes.
Because that for me is when we're overlooking that exploitative link. Then actually, if you've got a young person who's saying, well, I'm not offending to pay for it, but so-and-so is giving it me for free, then there's an opportunity there for a bit of education as well about debt bondage. Is anything really free in life? Yes. You know, this can happen. We've seen this happen. Just be aware of it. And if you've got any worries, any concerns, let us know. We can support. Yes. You know, through those sort of safe, supportive, ongoing conversations, just dropping those little kind of educative nuggets, I suppose, and then they go away and they mull it over, think about it, and 9 times out of 10 they come back and ask you more questions. So I think there's a skilled way to do it, and I think that youth workers are so skilled at that. And actually those statutory roles learn a lot from that. So yeah. So more signs to sort of spot as well, to consider and think about. You know, missing, returning home late. If this is out of the ordinary, And often what happens is young people get into trouble, and then actually, because they're getting into trouble, those sort of important conversations about where were you, who were you with, did you come to any harm, and making sure as well that they're aware that actually if anything did happen that make them feel uncomfortable and unsafe, that it's not about the fact that they were not home or not where they should have been, but actually that they know that they can talk about that openly. Also, missing return home interviews, really, really important. So for every child who goes missing, they should benefit from a missing return home interview. This should be conducted by someone who's not in the police. And this is to provide opportunities, again, that safe, non-judgmental space where those important questions are asked about where were you, who were you with, were you okay, did you feel safe, were you safe? But often what we know is that not every child or young person benefits from that process, unfortunately. It's inconsistent, but it should be happening. Also, you know, I think what's really important when we talk about missing, something that I say quite often is in order to be missing, you have to be missed. There are children and there are young people who live within family environments who are frequently missing but not consistently reported as being missing. There might be a parental apathy around them being missing, particularly for children who are maybe presenting with some really complex needs, challenging behaviours. For some parents, when that child goes missing, it's respite, so they won't necessarily always report it. Also, what we know sort of post-COVID is nationally what we're seeing is an increased cohort of children and young people who are electively home educated that haven't returned to school for a whole host of reasons. For many young people, you know, that thought of returning back into the school environment post-COVID is really anxiety inducing. So actually, we have a situation where parents are still having to work, children are at home. We make the assumption that because they're electively home educated, they're being educated, they've got constant observations on them, and that's not always the case. So there are situations of where children have actually gone missing from home but return home in time for their parents coming home for tea. And so when we think about missing, widen the lens. We're not just talking about children who are missing overnight. And children who go missing in the day, even if it's only for a couple of hours, can still be exposed to harm. Harm doesn't only happen in the dark. Also, young people who are missing from education, so they're still on the roll at school, but maybe, you know, they're turning up late or they're skipping certain classes. Those exploit children often will try to disrupt their education, because actually what they want to do is get that child to a point where they are excluded from school, which means that they're more available and easier to exploit. Also, children who are described and defined as being disruptive in class, what we know is that disruption can, as I've already mentioned, be kind of the exploiter almost sort of puppeteering that young person, trying to get them excluded from school so they're easier to exploit. But also it can be a trauma response. Children who are being exploited are exposed to trauma, and trauma can manifest in different ways. And sometimes that trauma can actually manifest in behaviours that are disruptive. So we need to be really thinking about what is that behaviour communicating when we're seeing that challenging, disrupting behaviour. Also, children and young people with unexplained gifts, possessions, money that can't be accounted for, that they can't explain. If they're not in gainful employment, how are they buying, you know, these really expensive tracksuits, trainers, multiple devices? And then also for exploited children who are being exploited sexually, those with sexual health problems, reoccurring infections, STIs, unwanted or multiple pregnancies can also be an indicator of child sexual exploitation. And then for those children who are being criminally exploited, again, they might present with some unexplained injuries as a result of weapon carriage, for example. So they are some key factors to look out for. Anything that I've missed, or any other factors that you can think of that we've not covered today? I think the key thing is professional curiosity. Regardless of your role, we all have that in our gift, to be really professionally curious. So rather than seeing a child's presentation as being difficult, you know, it really sort of try to get to the root causes of their behaviour and their presentation, and always have exploitation in our heads. Exploitation is so prevalent and so commonplace, it's highly likely that you will encounter children who are being actively exploited. And one way that children can be exploited is within a gang network. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now thinking about what is a gang. A gang, again, the terminology is really important. I think the term gang can be unhelpful. We're going to use the term gang today because it's a term that's universally understood. But I think it's important to recognise that there's a lot of stigma attached to this term. I don't know what you think, Tez, if you come across that as well, but I definitely think that sometimes, you know, we throw this term around, we band it around, we don't really know what the term gang means. We make assumptions that young people are in gangs when actually they're just part of a large peer network that's hanging around in certain locations and spaces. And then we unhelpfully profile that young person. I do a lot of review work, and what I've started to use as a different term is co-offending peer network. I don't know if you agree that's a good definition.
That's interesting terminology. Yeah, I'm gonna have to, take a deep dive on that one. I haven't heard that one before. But obviously, yeah, it's something that we extensively look at. You know, particularly in this module, actually, you know, and we look at, you know, even things such as, you know, Hallsworth and Young's work in terms of, you know, this whole idea of at a basic level that we have peer groups, then we have, let's just say, active gang membership, and then there's this idea of organized criminal gangs or organized criminal groups. So, you know, and there is lots of crossover and intersections between all three of them, really, where it's so easy, let's just say, to misdiagnose, misidentify a young person as being part of a gang, when actually the reality is what we, some of the terminology that we use is gang impacted environment. So you're growing up in a gang impacted environment, or an area that is gang impacted, and therefore having to navigate that space as a young person, which is obviously very problematic. You know, traveling to school, coming home, you know, just in the community, and what that, you know, the impact that has on one's identity within itself can be a real challenge. So yeah,
absolutely. And I think as well, you know, we need to be careful and cautious about labeling a young person as being part of a gang, because it puts them at risk.
Yes.
Because actually, by doing that, you know, if there's a case of mistaken identity, which I've come across relatively recently, it was a really nasty case where a young person had been labelled as being part of a gang just because his brother was historically, and then his brother actually successfully was supported to exit that gang network. His younger brother had no interface with that gang network, no association whatsoever. But because he lived in that gang impacted area, and because of, you know, his brother's previous links, and that ultimately led to his death. So, you know, we really need to be cautious. We need to be careful. We need to understand what we mean by gang. So the definition of a gang. I was just
going to say, not only that, Nikki, it's obviously the negative label of even carrying as a gang means that, you know, as we've seen, you know, in London with the gangs matrix, that young people have, you know, become associated with the gang. Like, that terminology gang can have real consequences, real, you know, when that's shared around professionals, you know, leading to people kind of losing homes, you know, the treatment in terms of a young person going through the judicial system as a gang, different from just somebody else that was, let's just say, grown up in that area, you know, can have a significant impact in terms of the way that they've been sentenced. So there's all kinds of implications, really, for that terminology, gang, and we should always be very cautious in terms of utilizing that term, especially to identify young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, really important that you've sort of highlighted that, because we know that sentencing is so much harsher for a young person that's got that gang label.
That's right.
Even though many of those children, if not all of those children, those networks have been victims of exploitation and abuse.
Exactly.
So it's really complex, actually, the whole concept of gangs, gang networks, gang associations. But it's really important, I think, that we understand what we mean by the term gang, because there's a clear definition on what gang is. And that definition that we adopt as part of this course, as part of this workshop, is a relatively durable, predominantly street-based group of young people who see themselves and are seen by others as a discernible group, engage in a range of criminal activities and violence, identify or lay claim over territory. So you've probably heard of like postcode wars, turf wars, street-based gangs, typically very territorial, which I'll talk about in a second, have some form of identifying structural feature and are in conflict with other similar gangs. Really important as well to highlight, and I think that this is something that we overlook, a gang is not a serious organised crime group, but a gang might have affiliations and links to an organised crime group. So an organised crime group and a street-based gang, they're really different in terms of how they operate. So both have interest in sort of criminality, criminal behaviour. If we think about what an organised crime group is, an organised crime group, so those involved in serious organised crime, they are less visible. They want to not be on anybody's radar. They often operate under what appears to be legal facades. So we often see serious organised criminals with multiple businesses that pay their taxes on time, do their VAT returns, are pillars of the community. So it's always a bit of a shock when these organised crime networks are sort of disbanded. The reason being is that they recognise that if they are apprehended by those in law enforcement and they're put before a court, that actually the lucrative nature of their business, their criminal enterprises, is going to slow or stop, because they go to prison. We've got things like their Proceeds of Crime Act, which means that all of their houses, their cars, everything else can be stripped from them. A gang, on the other hand, again, involved in criminality, but they are much more visible. They are often visible on social media. They often have a clear identity in terms of certain insignia. They might wear certain colours of clothing. So thinking about a gang where I live, they are often identifiable because they will wear something on their person which is purple. And I'm not just talking about any shade of purple, I'm talking about that sort of Cadbury's purple. So they're much more sort of visible. As I say, that strong social media presence, we see a lot of that with sort of like the drill that's posted on things like YouTube. And often that links with those serious organised crime networks come because they are essentially doing a lot of the running and the dirty work of that serious organised crime group. They're much more at risk of being identified by the police. They're also at huge risk because of those conflicts with other gangs as well. Really territorial, so often you will see them have locations and spaces that are linked to their gang network. My son is 14 and he says, you know, not linked to any sort of gang group network, but he's like, I know that there are certain parts of the city that I wouldn't go because they're linked to such and such gang. So even young people who are not affiliated, linked to, or involved with a gang network can be deeply affected by gang activity because it really creates that sort of culture of fear, no-go zones in those gang impacted areas. So that is the key difference between a serious organised crime group and a street-based urban gang. Tez, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add to that at all.
I suppose it would just be then to discuss, I don't know if you're going to go into the peer group itself, that obviously who are growing in that maybe those same areas. So let's just think about the young people in certain communities which we know are gang impacted. and the fact that they may know people, maybe relatives, may have older brothers, older siblings that are involved, but themselves are not directly involved. And then you can think about that whole idea then, and then the what we would refer to as the people that are aspiring to become part of that group, because as Nikki was saying, very visible, you know, holding an X amount of clout, certain amount of respect, and so that then becomes the highlight for young people wanting to become potentials, really, and want to be in that same space, be recognized, take up the reputation of, but not directly, but just still peers, so aspiring young people that want to become part of that, and also young people just growing up in the area that don't want to become part of that, but you know, are just maybe associated just simply because they come from a particular area. So yeah, that's the only thing I would add to that, Nick.
But I could put some context around that, actually. I think that's really important about sort of that kind of, you know, that aspiring membership and sort of that growing membership as well. So, you know, I remember when I was in policing, it was what I want to say, 2009, 2010. There was a group of young people that I was really concerned about, because I could see that they were involved in criminal activity. They were really territorial, you know, there were similarities in their dress, their language that they use. And I was almost kind of laughed at and like, oh, they're kids. You know, this is low-level stuff. And I'm thinking it starts somewhere. Now, fast forward, and they are pose a significant risk to the community where they're operating, to the point where they're no longer defined as an urban street-based gang. They are now an organised crime
group. Yeah.
And that's something that's important to note as well, that gangs can become very hierarchical, very organised, and in this case, they grew up. So those kids that everyone that was like, oh, you know, they're kids, a little bit of ASB and social behaviour. So basically, they grew up, they formed an organised crime group, but their brothers, their siblings, their younger family members then stepped up into their shoes, into that street-based gang that now has those links to their serious organised crime networks.
Yeah, essentially, we just say, like, you know, young people use the word plug. Yeah. You know, so you know, where am I getting my source of drugs from? You know what I mean? So you know, we'll hear the term, you know, plug, you know, and that is your the person that's got the links to you know, large quantities of drugs that, you know, are flooded into the streets, really. So yeah.
So, you know, if you've got a group of young people that you're working with and there's concerns there, never dismiss or undermine those concerns, because it's really important, that sort of early prevention, that you recognise the harms that could arise from not having those sort of disruption tactics to disrupt those really sort of negative peer networks. The other thing as well, you know, if we think about sort of the role of females in gangs, as I say, we often have a really stereotypical view that gangs are typically male dominated, but girls do form part of those gang networks and play a variety of different roles. But here's a little kind of task for you to do after this webinar, and you might want to do it as I'm talking if you want to. If you go Google boy gang or male gang, or you Google girl gang, what's really interesting as a bit of like a search exercise, if you sort of Google gang, you see predominantly males. Also, talking about stereotypes, predominantly black males. Gang affiliation, gang involvement is not a black problem. There are plenty of gangs that are dominated by white British children or Eastern European white children and young people. But if you have a look and do that exercise and you Google girl gangs, you tend to see girls in little jackets, almost sort of like, you know, from that film Grease. You kind of don't see the same imagery. And again, that kind of highlights the point that we're not recognising the harm that gang association involvement has for females and the roles that they play within gang networks. So just as a little task for if you're thinking about doing any training about this sort of issue going forward within your teams, it's always sort of like a good thought-provoking exercise to undertake. So there are some limited statistics in relation to the involvement of girls in gang networks. But actually the Children's Commissioner, who's done a great amount of research into the issues of serious youth violence and all of the topics and themes associated with it, has highlighted that it's believed, estimated that 34% of children involved in gangs are actually girls, are actually females. So that's quite a big proportion. But because of all of the things that we've talked about already, about the fact that we often overlook the role of girls, we often have those stereotypical views, I would argue that actually this statistic is the tip of the iceberg, and the reality is that there are many other females and girls that are embedded and involved or associated, affiliated with gang networks that we've not identified. Anecdotally, with some of the direct work that I've done as part of sort of like research with young male gang members, they frequently tell me that it is females who are running the show, using their words, which is really interesting as well, because what that kind of gives us an insight into is that in some cases, girls and women are actually playing out some really sort of key roles within those gang networks as well. So something to consider, something to be aware of. So I won't talk too much about this because I think that Tez, we've already sort of touched upon this really, about sort of active gang members that have got a clear, defined, active role within those gang networks. Those that have maybe some looser gang involvement, or maybe deemed as being sort of associated with a gang because of family networks, but might not necessarily have any active involvement within those networks. So when we've got concerns about a young person, whether they be male or female, who might have those gang associations or gang affiliations, it's important as well to be really sort of clear and explore the scale and the breadth of their involvement and association really as well. Going back to the point that we made about how sometimes we can attach labels to young people which are not helpful and can actually increase risk to them, can actually result in that young person being marginalised as well, and sort of really kind of punished even though maybe they're not actively involved in those gang networks. As going back to the point that we made about sentencing as one example. But something else that I just want to talk about, touching upon this, is that I came across a case recently where there was a young person, I think he was 13, excuse me, sadly he ended up actually losing his life because of serious youth violence. He was, well, he was of course a concern for professionals. They identified that there was an exploitation risk. So 13, using cannabis, frequently going missing. There was that lack of professional curiosity about his cannabis use, that was absolutely part of his exploitation. And the assumption was made that he had no gang involvement, no gang affiliation. The reason being is that he'd been seen in association with individuals from different opposing gang networks. And because of that, the view was formed that actually he's not at risk because he's not really part of any gang, he's not entrenched in any gang. However, the reality for him is that he was freelancing. And I don't know if any of you have ever come across that term or heard of that term. I think it's really important that we raise awareness of what freelancing is. So freelancing essentially refers to any young person who is not aligned with any one particular gang network, but has affiliations with multiple opposing gang networks. And that poses a real risk and problem. He was really keen to be more aligned and entrenched with one specific gang, but for a whole host of reasons, he found that difficult. And what that meant is that you didn't have that protection that many gang networks afford a young person who's associated with them. And ultimately that was a factor that led to his death, sadly. So Ted, I don't know if that's a term that you've come across or any sort of cases similar where you found that with young people that you've worked with.
Sorry, Nikki, I was slightly distracted there, so I didn't catch the whole of what you were saying. Apologies.
Yeah, just talking about the term freelancing, where you've got young people who are not aligned specifically to one gang network, but maybe have some looser affiliations and links with multiple gangs, and the risks that come with that, really.
Yeah. So yeah, just in just in terms of the work that we've been doing, often, I don't think I'll call them freelancers. But yeah, certainly the characteristics of not directly associated or connected, but they're involved, but they're just involved in lots of different gangs. It's much more blurred lines. But yeah, freelancer is an interesting term.
And also hood hopper, Megan's put in the chat, which is a term that I've heard of before, but essentially referring to the same thing. So
yes.
Interesting. And there's real risks attached to that, and I think it's really important that we recognise that issue, because it wasn't recognised by the professionals that were working to support him, essentially. Okay, so I'll just move forward through. So hang on, I've got the chat open. I can't multitask like Jane did. Okay, so gang environment. So we touched upon this already, talking about gang affected areas, gang impacted areas. Typically, gang activity tends to feature more predominantly in urbanised environments and spaces, although there is still gang activity in more sort of rural areas. The reason that we tend to see it in more urban areas is because obviously the denser population of people, of young people, and that convergence of groups that can pose a whole host of risk. So gang environment refers essentially to the immediate social reach of a gang or a gang stronghold area, gang footprint, a wider concept than that of the gang, including all those who spend time within that environment. And that goes back to what we've already talked about, that we're not just thinking about the defined, identified gang membership now. We're thinking about any part of the community that's impacted because they live in those gang impacted environments, not just children and young people that are sort of navigating those places and spaces. As we talked about, sort of my son knowing that he can't go to certain places. He actually can't go to a lot of places because I don't let him, not just because they're gang affiliated. But also we're thinking about, the elderly that are maybe too frightened to go out, and how that can lead to a whole host of social issues and social isolation, limited opportunity. We might have women and girls, for example, that feel unsafe to go to certain parts of their community, which may also, again, really restrict opportunities for activity, or maybe even activities in terms of linked to their job. So we need to think about how gang impacted areas has a huge detriment to wider society, not just those individuals that have those direct links to gang networks. I think that's it. Right, okay. So going back to the point that we made about gang membership and female gang membership, it's really important that we start to challenge that misconception that girls and women will be repulsed by violence, and because of that, they will not be likely to be aligned with or affiliated to any sort of gang activity. What we know, as we've already touched upon, is that females frequently involved in gang networks and may play a variety of different roles. They might be really active in gangs, they may be linked or affiliated to gangs because they have family members that are linked to a gang network. I frequently see this, so I've seen adult females who are loosely involved with gang activity because their sons are part of a gang, cousins, nieces, aunties, and often they are involved in gang activity because they're trying to safeguard their family members, their male family members that are part of that gang network. Conversely, I've also seen cases of where gang activity and gang involvement is part of the family norm and part of the family business. There is a female that I do some work with. She's phenomenal. She's got lived experience of this issue, and actually she wanted to become a prison officer, and she was completely rejected by her family because the expectation was that she would actually, as she reached a certain age, play a very active role in a gang that all of the family had links and affiliations to. Also, girlfriends of gang members as well, often referred to as wifeys, number ones, main girl, thinking about some of that terminology. It's really helpful and important to understand some of the terminology that's used, because if we hear that in conversation, that again should spark our professional curiosity to have wider conversations with children and young people. But also being mindful that some of this language is becoming quite normalised as well, so not always indicative of gang involvement. Baby mother as well, you hear that a lot. Often the girlfriends of gang members, they aspire to have babies with those gang members because that affords them another layer of protection, status and respect. So we really need to be thinking really broadly about safeguarding as well, because often what you find in these relationships is high levels of domestic abuse and violence. And also we need to think about the safeguarding of children that are born into those gang environments and those gang networks too. You might also hear the term link or links. This is a term that I know is used outside of gang networks and gang environments. It's quite a derogatory term. Essentially, a link refers to some sort of casual sexual encounters, casual sexual relationships. Girls who have associations with gangs that are referred to as links are often seen as being quite low value. They're often passed around. They might be used as part of gang initiations as well. So those females might actually be part of those gang initiations that involve group sex. So a person coming into a gang, they might actually, in order to be able to join a gang or be part of a gang, prove their worth by basically having group sex publicly in front of the other gang members. Massive trauma attached to that, not only just in relation to the females that are used in that way, but also to males as well who undertake these kind of initiation ceremonies. I would argue that that is a clear example of how boys and males linked to gang networks are also sexually exploited by being exposed in that way. Are these terms that you've heard of before, maybe come across, heard a young person refer to? I just sort of opened up the floor to you.
I think a lot of our kids in youth club that are most definitely not gang members use a lot of this language. It's like I think you mentioned earlier, it's quite normalised, some of these terms. But we had to do like an A to Z, we called it A to Z of road life the other day at work, because some of the old time youth workers have no knowledge of these words, and we had to get the kids to help us do an A to Z dictionary of what they're trying to say, because we had no clue. But yeah, they're quite normalised words.
Yeah, I'm definitely finding that this sort of language is becoming much more mainstream. And we have to ask the question, why? I think, again, it's that sort of social media influence, isn't it? This is an indicator that young people are seeing some harmful content.
I'm laughing, sorry, Nikki, I'm laughing because I think it was last week, if not the week before, you know, we talked about, you know, this whole idea of youth culture and gang culture and where they intersect. And obviously a question that we proposed was, you know, what came first? You know, was it gang culture or was it youth culture? And the whole idea of globalization. And so when we start bringing globalization into that mix, is like we can start to see the patterns, similar cultures are being imported around the world, exported around the world. So now we've got similar frames of reference, similar language, similar ideas. And so now it's all part of youth culture. So all the same languages that we're utilizing now, is that what we'll hear any average young person potentially engaged in a conversation about their link, their baby mother, you know, their girlfie, their wifey, you know, all of that terminology now is all part of mainstream culture. I wouldn't even say
And
youth culture. I'd say
Yeah.
mainstream culture.
no, I think you're right. And I think if you like listen to sort of, music and all of those influences, you hear it in that. It
Yeah.
is definitely more mainstream. So that's where that professional curiosity comes in, to actually not just accept sort of the language that's being used, but actually explore through supportive, safe conversations. If young people actually understand the context of this too. I did a piece of work in a school in St Albans, very leafy, very affluent, because they were really concerned about gang involvement, because of this kind of language that was being used. And it turns out, that it was, I think it was just sort of widespread because it was sort of within their peer networks. But it was great that they were really curious about it and that they'd identified the concerns. But I love Jane's idea about that development of an A to Z, but using young people, because language and terminology changes all the time. And I think that it's really key that we learn from them. It's not just about us imparting knowledge and education and awareness for them. It's got to be a two-way street, because this is their culture and we need to step into it and see it through their eyes. So I think that sort of piece of co-production is amazing and something that has to happen.
I think that's definitely a really great example. I am like, we're always cautious about slang dictionaries, just because things date so fast. But we get them, the need for professionals to try and keep up with some element of what's going on. But that's probably the best practice, Jane, if you do have access to young people, is to actually co-create what's going on. And in 6 months' time, you'd have to do it again.
You know what? It was mad because our local police team came in the office and we'd done it. We wrote it up on the on our big board, and even the local police were like, "Wow, I never knew that. I never knew that." We were like, "We never knew that either." It just changes so quickly. It's mad.
That's right.
It does change really differently, and I think that there's a danger, just as Ted says, really, that you can, because you can find these sort of like urban dictionaries on the web, but they are so massively outdated and the context has changed. And then what I've seen in the past then is like a professional trying to speak sort of street language slang, using all these gang terminologies to young people, and they just lose all credibility in the first 2 minutes.
I suppose it was quite interesting to see even the term gang itself, being utilized by young people. That's gang, as in to say that's cool, that's gang, like that's my gang, that's my, and then an ownership over that language, which I said has its dangers because of its obviously the way that society can take that, and professionals, and what that has real legal consequences to being affiliated with gang. But it's also just, like I said, so widespread that it's really difficult to navigate the two worlds of what's just actually youth culture and where is it kind of blurring the lines and really getting into issues around gang culture. Again, the word culture is around behaviors, but where does it actually be, where does that gang culture start and end, really? So we can actually deal with the framework of the structure, the actual structure of a gang.
Do though, I love that, the fact that, the way that language shifts and changes, because for me it's opportunity. It's opportunity to open up conversations. So if you hear a young person say that's gang, say, what does that mean? If they say, well, it's good.
That's right.
So he's been in a gang, good. And then that's a whole conversation starter. Again, opportunity to sort of impart knowledge, learn from them as well. So I think it's really important to have those conversations, step into their world. Okay, so I think we're coming up to sort of like 5:45 now. So I don't know if you think this is a good time for maybe a bit of a break, Tez, but if everyone's happy.
Refreshment break. I don't want it to be utilized as a hopefully you'll be back after the break, but just put yourselves on mute for now. Get yourself a little refreshment. and we'll be back in 15 minutes.
Yeah, sounds good to me. And what I'd ask is you just think about during your break as a bit of a task about the factors that underpin female gang involvement, just while you're making a cup of tea or having your leg stretched. And then if we come back sort of what it's now, oh, what time is it now? Sort of nearly 22, so come back for 5 to.
It's about 5 to.
Brilliant.
Times I'll make an announcement anyway. You hear me bellowing a final minute till we come back. Okay.
Brilliant. That's great. I'll see you then.
See you shortly, everybody. And also, just as you know, when you come back, if you just can just drop a few comments in. Obviously, lots of people have been joining us, but if you could just let us know who you are, where you're from, where you're joining us from today, and also what your profession is, and any thoughts that you might have about the session so far. That would be really great to kind of just collate that and just get an idea of who's in the room with us today. I know we've got some of our usuals, so welcome and howdy to you all. But yeah, we'll just be on a break now for the next 15 minutes. Appreciate it.
Okay, hi everyone. I don't know if this is Tez's job actually, whether I'm totally railroading you there, Tez, but it is 5 past, so hopefully everyone's had a leg stretch, had time for a cup of tea. Who's come back? Hopefully we've not lost anyone. It's always difficult at this time of evening, isn't it? Okay, so if you are there and you are back, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the factors that might underpin female gang involvement.
No problem at all, Nick. No problem at all. That's fine. You called the time well. I got caught drifting.
That's what I am, too bossy.
On point with that time, I see. On point with that time.
Any sort of thoughts about factors that might underpin female gang involvement? I know we've started. Oh, is that you, Amy? Is that you coming in there? No? Okay. Let's have a look then and have a think. So one of the sort of the key things to think about actually is when we're thinking about females and the factors that might actually underpin gang involvement, gang affiliation, gang association for them, is I suppose the key question is, are there different factors? Are there unique factors? Are there gendered factors? Or actually are there similar factors? And I suppose the way I would maybe approach that is that there are some similarities, but there are some absolute gendered factors as well. So some of the similarities that I think females and males share when it comes to sort of gang affiliation, gang involvement is kudos and lifestyle. What we know is that some of the sort of like media depictions of gang involvement, gang lifestyle, seem quite glamorous, seem quite attractive. The reality for many young people is that very different, but they might not find that out until further down the track, further down the line, when actually you know, they are sort of living in fear, or they are worried about not being able to exit that sort of gang scenario, that gang situation. Kudos as well. Many young people talk about actually, you know, for the first time in their lives, they're actually being part of a gang or affiliated with a gang, gave them a sense of sort of status and belonging. And that's really important, because often what you find is that individuals that are part of a gang network, are affiliated with gangs, they might actually have been marginalised elsewhere. So they might have been excluded from school, they might have been ridiculed because they might present with additional needs. And so, you know, that sort of status, that sort of belonging is really important. And that's important to all of us on a human level. When I talk about these sort of issues, I think it's really important that as practitioners, that we do some work to actually humanise this issue, because often what I find is those young people that have that gang label attached to them are dehumanised, often because practitioners, professionals, communities can't see past the criminality and the violence that they might be perpetrating. Also, attachment issues as well, not uncommon for individuals that have those gang associations or involvement to actually come from fractured family units, family relationships, and actually being in that gang space gives them that sense of belonging. Again, something that as humans, we all crave for that sense of belonging. Low and externalized self-worth as well. You know, again, that sense of sort of importance, that belonging, that can actually increase self-esteem. Also sort of coercion, grooming, and how that sort of exploitation interlinks with family loyalty, for example. We talked a little bit and gave an example of how actually in some families, gang involvement and gang association is not only normalised but expected. Cultural expectations as well, misogyny, gender roles, social conditioning. I think that this is quite specific for females, that actually sort of they sometimes feel quite oppressed, and that actually by being in that gang network, that gang environment, that they're protected from that kind of oppression too. Perceived protection. I use the term perceived for a reason. Many young people I know align themselves with gang networks because they feel unsafe in those communities. And it goes back to that point that Tez made about how actually it's not just directly affiliated young people that are impacted adversely by gang association, but also those living in gang impacted communities. And that actually, if they can't feel safe because in their communities, the practitioners, family are not being able to increase their feeling and sense of safety, as we often find, then aligning themselves with the people that actually make them feel unsafe can be a means of support and protection. And also, like we've already touched upon this, that culture of money, commercialism, respect and power. I wonder whether or not that's more felt by males than females. But I think that when we live in a patriarchal society and females are still feeling that oppression, particularly in some communities, that the power of sort of respect and power can be quite alluring to them as well. Any sort of thoughts, views on that? You might have some other ones. Use the chat if there's anything that pops into your heads. But I just want to go back to the point that I made actually about, you know, how we sometimes dehumanize those young people that are linked to, affiliated, directly involved with gang networks. Because, as I've already mentioned, we struggle to see beyond that criminal aspect. We struggle to see beyond the violence that they're often perpetrating. And we struggle to actually remember that we're talking about children, we're talking about young people, often who have a range of complex vulnerabilities and needs that have never been identified, assessed or met. And so what I think is really important is to centre our minds on that. I've certainly been in scenarios where I've looked at case records and I've spoken to a person who seems really, there's almost like an apathy, a bravado, they don't really see the gravity of their actions. And it's difficult sometimes, if we're being really honest, it's difficult to remember we're talking about children who've been exploited, children who have been victimised and often exposed to interpersonal violence themselves. And so how I sort of go back a few steps and make sure that I'm sort of grounded and I'm focused on that is by thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of need. You may have heard of this already. If you haven't, I would say Google it. It's really worth really understanding the hierarchy of need and Maslow theory for anyone working with children and young people. But essentially, in a nutshell, without going into this in too much depth, what Maslow's theory basically said is that regardless of our background, regardless of our socioeconomic status, our wealth, our position, our ethnicity, cultural factors, we are human beings, all of whom share basic needs. And that if our basic needs are not met in positive, pro-social, safe ways, then as human beings, because we have those innate needs, we will seek to get those needs met elsewhere. And in some cases, we will get those needs met in ways that are not safe, that are not supportive, and that are actually maladaptive. And I would argue that gang association, gang affiliation is an example of that. So if we're not getting, you know, our basic needs met and our basic safety needs met, so if we're not feeling safe and secure in our communities, if we're not feeling actually a sense of love and belonging, if we don't actually have that self-esteem because maybe we have been excluded from school, we have been told that we're not going to amount to anything, we have been marginalised, we are locked in positions of disadvantage, then we can begin to understand how we might try to meet those needs by aligning ourselves with groups and with networks who we believe can make sure that those needs are met. And so I think that that is really, really important to make sure when we are working with children and young people who are navigating these really complex networks, arrangements, communities, that we remember that at a basic human level, we all have needs. And if we are not getting those needs met, we will seek a way to make sure that we can have our needs met. Does that make sense to everybody? Des, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, if you've got anything to come in with there.
Was that me you was referring to? Sorry, Nick.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm doing several things.
And me.
Multitasking. Yeah, we had a really cool quote last week. I will see if I can get it up perhaps towards the end and just read the statement. But it just kind of, just paraphrasing here, but the statement was just saying, well, gangs isn't really our problem, or isn't the real problem. It's kind of like gangs, what they are doing is they are covering the needs that are not being fulfilled in society. So until we, resolve that issue, gangs is just the default mechanism that kicks into play where, society's needs are not being met, young people's needs are not being met, and therefore, so the issue is really about violence, because a gang, which we've explored in, I suppose, in many different ranges, it becomes a family that is providing physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization. It's providing those, albeit in the wrong way, but it is actually meeting the needs of young people where society's failed, families, society, school, our environment, police, government, call it what you will, have failed to provide those necessary needs for those humans. I won't even say young people, for those humans that need that. So it's a really interesting statement. I will try and drag it out so we can share with everybody. But yeah, we discussed that last week.
I think it's a really important statement because I couldn't agree more. I get really angry when I see all these interventions to sort of tackle gangs, and I think, you know what, you're kind of like stabbing in the wind, really, because unless you get to the underlying societal factors, you will always have these issues. So all of that resource, all of that money, we've got to go to grassroots, because actually what we've seen is an increase in exploitation, gang activity, and I struggle that people cannot see how that links with the complete decimation of youth work in this country.
Yeah.
And where you have poverty, we are always going to have these sort of issues too.
Yes.
Because it's survival, and that worries me because of where we are. I mean, people can't afford their mortgages, people can't afford rent, people can't afford to put food on the table. That is the reality of a growing cohort of families now. And so this is something that we're going to see more and more of. So really important that we're citing these issues. But where we have gangs, we have deep-rooted societal issues that are not being addressed.
Yeah.
And Megan's just put something in there that I like this quote. It's a really important quote. Desmond Tutu. We need to stop pulling people out the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. Again, goes back to the point of unmet need, doesn't it?
Yes. Yes.
So just moving on, in the interest of time, because we've had so much useful conversation today, but just thinking about specifically the roles of females. Baby mums get respect. If you're a gang member's baby mum, you're going to get looked after and respected by the whole gang. But if you're just a girl that's rolling with a gang, you're probably going to be treated like shit, to be fair. Talking about needs being met, there are females who have those links to gang networks who will aim, as I've already touched upon, to have children with gang members in order to have that extra layer of respect, extra layer of recognition, extra layer of protection. So again, goes back to what we've just talked about, how individuals, females who are linked to gang networks, will actually resort to desperate measures in order to get those needs met. And again, we need to look at that as a human level. If a female is having children with male members of gangs that actually probably exposed her to some significant harms, some real degrading acts and maybe even violence, and would then seek to have a child with that person, we need to ask why rather than make judgments about that, again linked to protection, status and belonging. Oh, can't seem to move the slides forward. And we need to think about sexual violence in a gang's context, and something that I would ask you to consider, again going back to the point that I made about widening the lens, that sexual violence is something that clearly and frequently impacts females that are linked to those gang networks, but also sexual violence is used in gangs to oppress and control male members too. It's not uncommon as part of initiation ceremonies for sexual violence to be used, as we've already touched upon in some of the conversations we've had, but also videos to be made, which is then used as a humiliation tactic. Sexual violence as well, you know, thinking about rape is often about power and control rather than sexual gratification. And something else to touch upon is the act of internal concealment of substances, plug-in as well. Yeah. Something that's a real taboo topic, frequently used in gangs. Females are useful currency because, without putting too fine a point in it, females have more places physiologically to conceal substances and items linked to the commission of criminality. Again, not talked about, not considered as a form of sexual abuse and exploitation. It's not recognised in law as an act of sexual abuse. The Home Office, they considered it and then decided that actually the Sexual Offences Act doesn't need to be amended in order to include acts of plug-in. Not really sure the rationale behind that, but that's where we are. But important to recognise that males and females who have links to gang networks that are linked to drug distribution and supply may internally conceal substances either by force or by being coerced to. So some real significant risk to their health and well-being there. Taboo topic, we need to talk about it with our young people and make them aware it happens, because if we don't tackle the taboo, if a young person is then subjected by that practice or impacted by the practice of plugging and internally concealing, who are they going to talk to? Who are they going to approach? We need to tackle the taboo and take the shame away from it so they know they can seek help, support and protection if this is something that's impacting on them. Some research in this area also has shown that there are 3 forms of sexual violence or exploitation affecting young women and girls that are quite unique to gang environments and gang contexts. So, for example, sexually assaulting or having sexual relationships with a young woman associated with a rival gang member in order to disrespect him. This is something that it takes place quite frequently in order to disrespect rival gang networks. There's a real risk to this, not just in terms of the female who's being subjected to this practice, often as well, that's not consensual, but also to individual gang members as well, because where this kind of practice has taken place, that increases tensions between those gang networks and increases the propensity of serious youth violence that can accumulate and has frequently, as we know, accumulated in loss of life. Also, sexually assaulting females as well, again, as a means of disrespect, trying to provoke the gang. And then also getting young girls and women to use their sexuality to set up rival gang members. This is called a honey trap, and we've got a couple of cases that can give you some examples of a honey trap. I don't know if any of you have actually watched 24 Hours in Police Custody. In the latest series, I think it's still available on Channel 4, I think it is. There's a 2-part episode that actually details a case where honey trapping was used. Yeah. It's outside of the context of a gang. It's actually, or at least that gang element wasn't really explored within the episodes. It could have a link to a gang. These females are actually working for a male to set up an individual in order to rob them. So they would drug them, they'd use like Rehypnol, I think it was, and then they would rob them. And this was a robbery that went wrong. But honey trapping is really common within gangs as well.
Don't know if it's me, but I think we're losing you slightly there, Nikki. You seem to have frozen, but it could be me. So if anybody wants to just jump in the chat and let us know.
You Taz.
You're the same as well. You're experiencing the same. Cheers, man. So,
Yeah.
all right. Hopefully we should be back. So we'll just go to the comments for now. Megan saying she had a case where a young man was being criminally exploited, and perpetrators paid for a hotel room for him to prepare the substances rather than a cooked property. He reported to the elders would traffic girls to the room for him for entertainment, and he reported feeling pressure to engage in sexual activity, which impacted his freedom, capacity to give consent, and of course the girls were sexually exploited too. So that's quite a devastating example. Just looking for Nikki as well at the same time. If anybody else has got any thoughts or suggestions or comments on that last point that Nikki was talking about. Will we wait for her to port herself back in? No? Okay. Well, I'll go back to my statement then, shall I? Because I did drop it in the comments, something that we looked at last week in a lot more detail on the course. It says gangs are not the problem, because if poverty, racism, injustice, inequalities, disadvantage still exists within society, then gangs will always form. Gangs are like surrogate families. They replace all the ills that society fails to provide our youth. However, the problem I do have with gangs is the violence that exists within them. If the community, the elders, the children are afraid to be in their own community because of gangs, then it is our duty to eradicate this and make our communities safer. And that statement was by Craig Pickney, 2020, quoted. Yeah. Oh, here we go. I think Nikki's back in now. Let's just connect her in. And now I have to find her, and I think she's still connected.
Sorry everyone, I'm having an internet issue. It's because like my eldest is back and rinses the internet, I think, so it's chopped me out.
Just jumped on PlayStation.
Honestly, I think
Our surge.
I've only got one of them home as well at the minute. It's usually worse. Right, I'll see if I can share my screen anyway. Hang on a minute.
No worries. I've just made you co-host. We was just Megan gave us an example, so we read through that, and then we kind of went back to the statement. I found the statement, I posted it in the comments, so we was just having a look at that statement.
Oh, brilliant. I'll just find my place and get back to it. I spoke too soon about technology, didn't I?
We did. We kind of cursed ourselves at the start, didn't we?
Yeah, I think so. It's biting me on the bum now. Right, hang on a second.
No worries.
There we go. Back. All okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. So where were we? Sorry about that, everyone. So there are, of course, some forms of sexual violence.
Oh, sorry, your slides haven't come back yet, Nikki. Sorry.
Oh, Why is that not sharing the
Or was
slides?
they giving you the wrong signal to say, yes, I can see it? I thought it was going to take a few seconds. Try again. There we go.
Is that okay? And then
We can see now. Yeah.
I'll see if I can just make them bigger. There we go. Okay. So hopefully you can see that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So forms of sexual violence, of course, can occur that are not individual to gang context or unique to gang context. So the creation and distribution of sexual images, sexting, already touched upon the fact that it's so mainstream in our schools now concerningly, rape and other sexual assaults, sex with multiple individuals, and that's been part of exploitation that can happen outside of those gang contexts. Sexual activity in exchange for money and goods, which again, of course, linked to exploitation. And sexual activity in exchange for status, protection, and non-tangible goods. So even if we haven't got a child who's being given goods that are tangible and goods that are kind of like evidence of their exploitation, it doesn't mean to say that they're not being exploited. And pressure to engage in sexual activity as well. So going back to violence and sexual violence in a gang context, this is a quote from a young person that was linked to a gang. In gangs, if it goes wrong, then you have the whole gang on your back. They like gang rape you. I've seen pictures. There's one going around my college. A girl has a sign up saying, I'm a slag, with her clothes off, naked, crying her eyes out, everything with bandanas in the background. What's really important is that we recognise the role that social media and technology has in the sexual abuse of young women and girls who are linked to gangs. Even if that female was actively supported to successfully exit that gang, the fact that this image circulating, the fact that this is going around colleges, whether that be her college or colleges of peers who know her, is also sort of perpetuating that trauma. That trauma is likely to be long term. The reason that we've included this quote in here is because what's really important is that we recognise that the abuse does not stop even if we employ and utilise successful gang exit strategies, because of the use of technology and because of the long-term consequence of trauma as well that's associated with sexual violence. So we talked about honey traps before I had an internet meltdown, and we talked about the fact that we were going to talk about some cases of honey trapping that have involved young people and gang networks. And there was one such case that dates back to 2008, so quite an old case now. The reason that we've used this case is because we're still seeing this kind of scenario play out now. So this isn't a practice that's outdated. This is a practice that's still prevalent today. This involved the stabbing of a 16-year-old. He was actually clubbed with a baseball bat multiple times and then stabbed multiple times. So we often see in these kind of contexts overkilling as well. And actually it was a 15-year-old who he believed was his girlfriend, that he believed he was in a relationship with, who lured him to a cul-de-sac where he was then ambushed, beaten and killed. The female that orchestrated this attack was 15, and unbeknown to Shakilis, she was actually in a relationship with an individual who had links to a gang. He felt really disrespected by the fact that she'd formed this relationship with the victim and ended his relationship with her. She was completely distraught because that relationship actually was a form of status, protection in the community that was gang impacted. And she was really distressed by his decision to end that relationship and clearly felt that she would be exposed to risk. He then said, if you want us to reform this relationship, will you set up the victim? She agreed and did so via the honey trap. So what we can see here is a real tragic loss of life, a loss of life for the victim, of course, but also, the impact on her life as well, that she'd also clearly been exploited and coerced into this arrangement, which led to her imprisonment. Don't know if this is a case that maybe you've come across before. It was quite a high-profile case at the time, and I know that this case is often talked about when we're talking about the issues that we're talking about today. But you know, it's not a unique case, as I say. We see many cases of honey trapping. A similar case, a slightly more recent case, was a case that involved Leonie Granger. She was convicted of her role in the death of a 56-year-old. The reason we use this case is to kind of highlight that it's not just youths that are impacted by this. Leonie Granger actually was working for a crime network that was involved in staging robberies. She was recruited into that crime network, and she was basically given the task to honey trap and to set up vulnerable males. She befriended a victim who was 56 in a casino, posed as his girlfriend. He was quite vulnerable, lonely, isolated, and then when she gained entry to his property, she allowed these individuals access to the property, where they then tied him up and robbed his property, but essentially led to his death as well. So really sort of highlights how women are valuable commodities to gang and crime networks in terms of their sexuality, and how that sexuality is used and commodified in order to carry out crime, whether that be sort of reprisals or whether that be acquisitive crime and criminal acts as well. So again, another case of honey trapping, you know, a female in this case here. If you Google this male, you will find out some more details of this case, but again, very similar. He believed to be in a relationship with the perpetrator that set him up. And during that court case, something that she said was, "I felt sorry for him, but I had no feelings for him. And I didn't want to be there when it was happening." And by it, what she's referring to is the multiple stabbing. Again, there was an element of overkilling in this case, and she was completely traumatized by what had happened and what she'd been part of. So if there's any questions, feel free to use the chat or just to share any reflections at this point before we move on to the psychology of victim blaming. Something that I'm really passionate about talking about and raising awareness of. So I'll just hand over to you at that point and see whether you've got any discussion points or any points of clarity before we move on. No? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next part of this presentation, which is about the psychology of victim blaming. So if you recall, when we started the webinar, we talked about how victims of exploitation, victims of abuse, are not always perceived as victims. Their victim status may be overlooked. They may be, if they've been exposed to extrafamilial harms and abuse beyond their family homes, seen as being complicit in the circumstances that are linked to their exploitation, that are linked to their abuse. We see this all the time, actually, both for victims of child sexual exploitation and victims of criminal exploitation. Again, often because with criminal exploitation, we struggle to humanise it, we struggle to look beyond the criminal element of it. But with sexual exploitation, you know, we often take the stance that there was something that the victim did, something about the victim's actions that put them at risk. If we think about our response to child sexual exploitation, just to put some context around that, we often see and use screening tools. So when a child has been identified as being a victim of child sexual exploitation, we will use a screening tool to carry out a risk assessment. And I'm not here to sort of say that we shouldn't be using screening tools. I think that the right screening tool can be useful at helping us to quantify risk. But actually, if we think about some of the screening tools that are in use, often what those screening tools do is think about what the victim needs to do to limit the likelihood of them being harmed again. You know, they look at their dress, they look at the hot spots that they're hanging out in, they look at their peer networks, which is not always inherently wrong in terms of peer networks, but actually, where's the focus on perpetrators? Where's the focus on disrupting those individuals that are exploiting children? That is an example of victim blaming. Victim blaming can be done with the best of intentions, by the way. So those people that have formulated screening tools have done so with the right intent, have done so because they want to help victims, they want to protect children. But we need to be really careful about how we go about that, which is the whole point of this part of the webinar. So what do we mean by victim blaming? Well, victim blaming is the act of transferring blame for an act of sexual violence or any other form of violence and victimisation and abuse away from the perpetrator, placing blame squarely on the shoulders of the person that they have offended against, the victim. Okay. Something else to say before we go into this is a safe space. This is a completely safe learning space. And I'm going to start by saying I've victim blamed. I know I've victim blamed. I've victim blamed when I was a police officer. I wasn't necessarily aware at the time that I was victim blaming, but now I have the knowledge and awareness of victim blaming, I can be retrospective and realise that I did. I'm likely to victim blame in the future. The reason being, I'm a human being. Every single one of us on this call today has our own biases, and those biases have come from our experience of the world. And so what I hope to do is to provide a safe space where we can be really candid and really reflective. And even if you don't want to contribute to the chat or the conversation, just for you to reflect on your own practice and recognise that it's okay to acknowledge that you might have victim blamed in the past and that you might victim blame in the future. Because it's until we're aware of victim blaming that we can't be reflective. And for me, being reflective is the first step to change. So why do we need to challenge victim blaming, and why do we need to reflect on ourselves? Well, what we know is that when we blame victims, this facilitates abuse and exploitation. The reason being is that we're not focused on the perpetrator, we're not focused on disrupting that activity, and instead we're fixated on what the victims need to do, which means that perpetrators are free to go about their business. Also, what victim blaming does is it normalises hostile misogyny. Now, victim blaming isn't just something that happens to women and girls, by the way. Boys and men are also victim blamed. An example of that is in the context of child criminal exploitation. But women and girls are subjected, I would say, to a more heavy bombardment of victim blaming because of things like misogyny, things like, well, you shouldn't be wearing that. If you have multiple sexual partners, what do you expect? Of course, at some point, you're likely to be raped or subjected to some form of sexual violence. It also blurs that victim-perpetrator overlap. If we victim blame, what we tend to do is we diminish that victim status, and we might see children and young people and vulnerable victims actually being framed as being responsible for the harm that was imposed upon them. A criminal exploitation context is a real prime example of this, for example, where, you know, we struggle to recognise that the reason that that child was found in that house where drugs were being distributed from was because they were exploited, which is why they were there. And also longitudinal trauma as well. We know that by victim blaming, what happens is that not only are professionals and communities blaming victims, victims internalise that responsibility and blame, and for their whole lives often blame themselves for things that have happened to them. So the term victim blaming is not new, by the way. I think victim blaming can feel like it's a bit of a buzz term, something that we're only really just starting to talk about. But actually, the term victim blaming was first coined in a book by William Ryan, which dates from 1971. And so that's really important. We're not talking about anything new here. And this is where within his books, he was actually focusing on how Black families, Black communities were being blamed for being victims of racism, for being victims of poverty. And again, that was linked to kind of sort of stereotypes. I would argue that we still see examples of that with adultification bias. We have not moved away from it. 3 main ways that we can and might victim blame. We might apply behavioural victim blaming, where actually we think it's the behaviour of the victim that has caused them to be exposed to harm. Characterological victim blaming, something about their character, which means that they have been exposed to harm. So, for example, well, she's promiscuous. That's why she's been subjected to sexual abuse and violence. An example of behavioural victim blaming might be, you know, a person goes out and they drink too much alcohol. Their behaviour is what's caused them to be harmed. No, it isn't. It was the choices of the decision maker and the decision making of the perpetrator that made the decision to hurt that victim who is responsible. And situational victim blaming. You know, if that person hadn't walked in that park in the dead of night, they wouldn't have been abused and harmed. So going back to the impact of victim blaming has a devastating impact, not only on those who have already experienced harm and trauma, whether they've disclosed it or not, but also because it makes it far less likely that children and young people will ever have the confidence to seek help and support if they need it. I remember a conversation that I had with a young person who had been exploited sexually. There was loads of red flags that had been overlooked. And through our conversations, you know, I kind of said to her, did you ever tell anybody about this? And she was like, absolutely not, because this had happened to my friend as well. And when she actually said anything, she was blamed for what happened to her. So I know that nobody was going to take me seriously and I would be held responsible. So really important that we tackle victim blaming, because until we do, we are going to have victims who never come forward, victims of intrafamilial abuse, victim of extrafamilial abuse. So it's all of our responsibility to be aware of victim blaming, to be self-critical and reflective, and to challenge victim blaming when we see it in community and professional contexts. Now, this is something for me that was the light bulb moment when I started to discover and learn about victim blaming. I understood a psychological theory called theory of a just world. And believe it or not, what this psychological theory sort of pinpoints and highlights is that we as human beings tend to believe in some sort of cosmic justice. And that sounds ridiculous, right? But actually, when we unpick it and explore it, it's not that ridiculous at all. We tend to believe that if we are good, law-abiding, moral people, that we are somehow not going to have bad things happen to us. Whereas conversely, if we are bad, we commit criminal acts, we're selfish, we're not law-abiding, we're not community-minded, that actually bad things are more likely to happen to those bad people. Now, if you've ever used the word karma, or if you've ever said things like, oh, the chickens have come home to roost, my nan used to say that all of the time, or if you've said something like, what goes around comes around, you know? Yeah, right. Another one. Then actually what you're doing is you're subscribing to that belief, that element that there's some kind of cosmic justice in the world. And we only have to flick through the paper or turn the news on and then quickly turn it off, because what that does is that actually challenges that belief. It really does change, that narrative.
Yeah, it's a big narrative, isn't it, really? And like you said, it's everywhere. It's in, you know, consistently in the media will put, you know, portray that, that, you know, bad things happen to the bad people, you know, type of scenario. So yeah,
massively. And it's like, you know, if we sort of read a newspaper article about somebody that there was a charity worker and then he went out and then he was killed on the street, that's unsettling. That's unsettling, not only because it's awful, it's unsettling because it really shakes that psychological security, that narrative that we've adopted. And the reason that we adopt that narrative is because if we recognise that we can be a good person, that bad things might still happen to us, we might never leave the front door. So actually we have this psychological buffer that protects us from anxiety and stress. And it is this subscription to that belief to that narrative that absolutely underpins victim blaming. Because when we hear that somebody has gone out in the community and been subjected to a horrific act of sexual violence, what do? Before we empathise with them, we tend to think about all of the reasons why that's happened to them, because by doing that, then we can convince ourselves that that is less likely to happen to us. And that's where the victim blaming comes in. So we will think about, you know, the situation that the victim is in. Well, actually, I wouldn't go there at night, so it's not likely to happen to me or the people that I care about. Well, I wouldn't wear that at that time of day. So because I'm not dressed like that, it's less likely to happen to me. We're trying to constantly convince ourselves that these are acts that will only happen in certain scenarios to certain people in order to keep that sense of psychological safety. Does that make sense to everyone?
Very powerful.
It really was a light bulb moment.
It's a powerful, you know, challenge to, you know, let's just say a common mindset. You know, I'm having to dig deep now and look at even myself and that belief. So I think you've unhinged something there, Nikki. Thank you for that one.
It's interesting, Ted, you know, when I look back, I mean, the one I loved policing. I did. I'm glad I left policing, don't get me wrong, but I sat in the training when I learned about this and I thought, this is part of the reason why I left the police.
Right.
Because what I was seeing, you know, you're exposed to trauma on a daily basis in a variety of different contexts. And what I was realising actually was that the most horrific, life-changing things were happening to really good people.
Yeah.
And that shook me. And I was starting to form a very uncomfortable view of the world, which was definitely part of my decision to leave the police, because my psychological buffer was being shaken on a daily basis.
Interesting.
So, yeah, absolutely. So victim blaming. It's important we understand we do it, and there's psychological reasons why we do it. And if we know we do it, we can stop ourselves, we can reflect, we can challenge ourselves. But again, humanise it. If you're sitting here and you're reflecting on your practice thinking, I think I might have victim blamed, you know, humanise it. There's psychological reasons why you have, and psychological reasons why we do. Okay.
Let us know your thoughts, people. Let us know your thoughts and your thinking. Don't just let me and Nikki bank back and forward. You know, jump in the chat and let us know, you know, how some of this information may be even impacting yourself or not. Tell us if you disagree. Feel free.
Any thoughts at all? It's quite a lot to take in, actually. It can be a bit of a, oh, wow, that's a lot to think about, a lot to consider.
It is. We bounce from concept to concept, but you know, those that are with us on the regular course, they know how we do. Yeah, lots of heavy, you know, theories and insightful models. Tia says, I believe in like yin and yang, and there's a bad in good and good in bad. Okay.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So a little balance in the universe. I think that's where I am. There's some sort of yeah, I think there is yeah, I think it would probably subscribe to something quite similar to that, actually, Tia. Of even within the chaos itself is part of the balance. So yeah, I don't know.
Really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting theory. Sandra Hemmings, I have often victim blamed in my practice and must reflect more in this. I'm glad to know we're getting those cogs ticking. And
well, that's amazing.
Being so open, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really brave to be really open, and I think it's not until we're open. You know, being open is the first step of challenging victim blaming practice. And so, you know, I think that's
I think it's just I think it's just what you said there. Really, that is it. Lenin, that theory there.
William Lerner.
William Lerner, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to look back at the slides for that one. That's yeah, that's unhinged me. That's got me there.
It's really interesting.
It's really interesting.
But, you know, thinking about sort of like victim blaming as well, it's interesting some of the language and the narrative used by those young people in gang contexts that actually do victimise other peers and young people. You know, so this quote here, I don't use the term rape, even though, you know, we know what rape is, we know what constitutes rape. The reason maybe the term rape isn't used is because then that would really, again, that individual would have to face the gravity of what they've inflicted on another young person.
Okay.
It's not talked about as rape. They just say this is what happened, took her to the house, told her to do it, do this, and she did it. They don't say we forced her. Most of the time they don't have to force them. Obviously that's the case in many cases because of the fear factor.
Power dynamic. Yeah,
and power and fear. As I once said, once I've implemented fear into them, it's easy to get what you want. So again, we could see some victim blaming in this statement. Well, we didn't force them, she just did it. But actually not recognising that the reason that that person seemed, you know, like she didn't have to be forced is because of the fear factor that's already been instilled. So you can see here how sort of maybe some of the narrative is downplayed. So we don't have to actually focus on the fact that we have a clear victim when there's been acts of violence like this carried out. Okay, so just in the interest of time, because I'm going to have to leave you with Tez at 7 because I feel like I've got children everywhere to pick up today and to sort out. So research has shown that sexual exploitation of males in the gang environment are generally more discrete incidents with clear gang-related motivation, unlike the wider social phenomenon of sexual violence against young men. So what this research is highlighting is that actually sexual violence seems quite unique to a gang context. These include pressure to engage in sexual activity in group-based scenarios, as we've already talked about, as part of gang initiations. The non-consensual recording of sexual activity, which, as we've already touched upon, can be used to humiliate those individuals and coerce them to remain in a gang. Forced stripping as well, again, as a tactic for humiliation, and targets for status as well. So, you know, it kind of to move up the echelons of the gang to get more kind of kudos and status and respect, that individual might be coerced into committing sexual violence against other young men, not for sexual gratification, but for dominance and power and control. In terms of the sexual exploitation of men outside of the gang's context, again, something that's overlooked, and there's a great piece of research, I'll pop it in the chat, worth a look at by Dr. Now this is when I can't talk and type at the same time, Dr. Jackie Devlin Montgomery. And if you Google this, briefing paper 1, it's a really useful read. What that does is have a focus on the sexual exploitation of boys and the barriers that prevent us actually as professionals from identifying male victims of exploitation. And in that, there's definitely some elements of victim blaming in there. Things like, well, he can't really be a victim because look, he's 6'4". There's some great case study examples there that highlight victim blaming and how actually that means that male victims of exploitation are frequently overlooked. Worth a read if you can find the link. Thinking about sort of, I don't know if I've missed a slide actually. So I've got boxes up, so I can't get to my button. Hang on a minute, let me minimize the chat. I'll go backwards, not forwards. While I find my place, any questions on any of that we've talked about? And has anyone actually come across that research that I've just popped in the chat?
I'm getting the briefing paper number 2. Oh, here we go. I found it.
Yeah, I think there's actually 3 briefing papers, all worth a read, but in the context of exploitation of male victims, it's briefing paper 1.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Taylor. The link, yeah, you beat me to it. You put the link in. Well done.
Oh, brilliant. That's great. I should have just done that, shouldn't I, actually?
Yeah.
Okay, so another quote here from some research into gang networks. So I've done it to kids before. I've been saying, go in there, what's up with him? He's a girl. You know what I'm saying, I'm a finisher, you can go in. And this is talking about sort of that gang initiation, that sexual activity with multiple females as part of that ritual and that integration into those gang networks. And he's like, I'll go in a minute. You can see in their eyes that they don't want to go in. So when I first beat a girl in that, I got not peer pressure, and that's how I lost my virginity, isn't it? Because actually it's not just about the sexual acts, it can also, as part of that initiation, be about, you know, going and physically assault, physically abuse females as well. So when we're thinking about the harm to individuals that are linked to gangs, females can be exposed to high levels of sexual violence, but also domestic abuse as well if they're in a relationship and they're aged over 16 with gang members, and physical violence as well. And also we need to think about the trauma for boys who don't want to be part of these initiations. As I've already said, we can't overlook that, but we frequently do. And because of gender roles and gender stereotypes, the fact that actually they can't express emotion, they can't back down, they have to feel that they need to go through with these acts. And also, if they don't, for some individuals, they're worried about the physical risk to them of not doing so too. So let's, as we come to sort of like the last 10 minutes, think about the challenges faced by professionals, practitioners, parents and carers to tackle some of the issues of exploitation and gang involvement and the harm within those contexts that we've talked about today. Lack of information, resources and funding. Often what we find in communities is that services that work specifically to support children and young people who are exposed to harm in these contexts are short-term funded. The funding simply isn't there. We've already touched upon the impact on youth work, and lack of information as well. So often agencies, services, professionals are not even sure of what's available in their local area to refer and signpost into. And I often find that there's a real lack of information and support for parents and carers too. Also, the historical lack of trust of statutory services within communities, and this is really relevant now. I sadly don't think that policing has ever been in a poorer state than it is at the minute, and in terms of trust, that's really difficult, and how you rebuild that trust with communities that have been failed by services is really, really difficult. That's not to say that there aren't practitioners, professionals working within statutory services that don't do a brilliant job, because we know that they do. But there are legacy issues as well that take a long time to overcome. So I think that there's a real important role for third sector services to bridge that gap between trust. And I think that that has got to be the way forward. Also, exit routes for girls and boys that are involved and affiliated with gangs. This can be really difficult. It's not a case of gangs are dangerous, you shouldn't be involved in these gangs, so just leave. There is a real threat and risk to any female or any male who want to leave a gang network. It's often seen as the ultimate disrespect for those individuals that have been indoctrinated into those networks to leave. And those threats are not just perceived, they are very, very real. And so exit strategies must come with safety planning, with multi-agency support and engagement that's coordinated to make sure that actually those children who want to navigate away from gang networks can safely be supported to move from A to B. Confidentiality as well. Young people are really worried about, if they disclose information, how that information will be handled. Of course, we have safeguarding procedures within our organisations that we work within and local areas, but we need to be thinking about how we include young people in conversations about what's going to happen to the information that they share with us, and recognise the risk to information sharing too, and as part of our safety planning, factor that in. There's also within communities a real culture of silence, and that's very much linked to a culture of being labelled a snitch, a grass, a rat, if we share intelligence and information. But there is ways to share intelligence and information, and ways we can empower young people to do so anonymously. You might have come across or heard of something called Fearless. Fearless is essentially a Crime Stoppers platform specifically for children and young people. I talk about this to young people all of the time. Often they're not even aware of it, but it's a way that they can share concerns, worries, intelligence about things that are happening within their communities, things that are causing them to feel unsettled and safe, insecure, under that sort of veil of anonymity. So Fearless, if anyone's got a link to that to pop in the chat, it's definitely worth talking to young people and raising awareness of that platform. Fear of retribution, again, going back to the point that I made about retribution not just being perceived but a real threat. Safety planning is imperative. And also sort of that victim and self-blame, worried about being blamed by professionals, by parents, by those closest to them, but also self-blame as well. Victim blaming is something that is self-perpetuated, and something that when we're thinking about victim blaming, we have to challenge, give those assurances. This is not your fault. You did not consent to being exploited. You cannot consent to being abused. Really important messages to keep reiterating. So in terms of solutions, let's leave this on a high note. Training, things that we can do. Training, the fact that you're all here today shows that you're committed to change. Much training, like the training today, is free and accessible, can be done online. We know, we've already talked about sort of campaign cuts of valuable youth services and provision. Lobbying your local councillors and your MPs can be really productive at ensuring that the spotlight is on these issues politically. So lobbying for increased funding and the prevention of further cuts. Also building relationships, just touched upon this. Those of you that work in third sector organisations play such an important role in building those relationships between local communities and statutory groups and organisations where actually that trust has been eroded over time. Educating young people about healthy relationships, consent, rape is really important too. So if they are in networks, whether that be a gang network or peer groups, and actually that they have been subjected to abuse, non-consensual acts, that they can identify that they have been victims of abuse and harm. Challenging rape culture, myths and victim blaming narratives. We've touched upon that as well today. And also sharing information responsibly, recognising that some information is need to know in order to keep children safe, but make sure as part of safety planning you assess breaches of confidentiality and the potential harm that can come to sharing information that's been shared with yourselves. Creating platforms for role models and mentors of people that have actually changed their lifestyle. So young people that are currently going through what they went through have a beacon of hope and somebody that has that shared lived experience. As a practitioner, I don't have that lived experience and I'm mindful of that. And I'm also mindful that there's limitations to maybe the support that I can give to young people, but recognise the support that those with lived experience can give in that alternative lens. Also know about sexual violence projects locally for boys and girls and be able to signpost them into those projects for additional support, and making sure as well that you are ahead and have your finger on the pulse when it comes to social media use and the use of social media platforms and how those platforms are being used to perpetuate harm. I'll finish there. I've come at 7. I've got a couple of minutes for any questions before I do hand it over to Tez. I really hope that today has been thought-provoking and useful in some small way. But any questions before I dash off, feel free to ask them. If I can answer them, I will.
Whilst those questions are coming in, I'd just like to thank you, Nikki, once again, for delivering a phenomenal masterclass for us. You guys have been in for a treat today. So much appreciated. Yeah, if you could just give us your feedback on the seminar, and that would be really great. Much appreciated as well. For any comments and feedback, again, you can drop that in the chat. Just to let people know again, whilst waiting, that you can follow Nikki at her socials. So go ahead, Nikki, give us your socials.
Oh yeah, if I can remember what they are. I don't deal with my socials for a reason.
Yeah.
I'm not technologically enabled. Here we go. I'll put my website in. And then
Put the website in. I think Leah did drop the website in a little earlier as well, but by all means drop it in again. If you are on LinkedIn, then I think you can probably just do a search for Nikki Holmes.
Yeah.
On there, she's a quite a prolific writer, and is always putting up really interesting content through her posts and sharing of her practice. So we thank her for that. So you can connect with her there. Also, don't forget to connect with us as well, ACT CIC, on all your socials, _ if you're on your Instagram, if you're on the good old LinkedIn, then we have our own page there, but you can also connect with me, Tesla White, on LinkedIn as well. We are in the background working on a few things. Actually, we're building a little bit of a network space for practitioners. So certainly look out for that. If you are, in fact, a show of hands, who's done their serious youth violence scorecard and have got their score from us? I know what I'm talking about. Put your hands up if you've done that. If you haven't, then it's something that you definitely want to do for a little 5 minutes exchange of your time. Then you can get a full-fledged report that will break down, your profession, your practice in several different layers, whether that's knowledge and your understanding, whether it's your own professional development, your experience, your personal attributes and qualities. We'll give you a score against that, and it's a nice handy piece of a tool that you can use as a bit of, we heard Nikki talking today about reflective practice. So it's a great way of reflecting on your skills and just where you're at, and it gives you some really great tips for how you can progress forward. So you can do that. No worries, Nikki. I know you need to go.
Yeah, just to say a big thank you, Tez, for asking me to come back on, and a massive thank you to everyone for giving up an evening. I really do appreciate it. I appreciate the platform, and hope to continue the conversation with some of you offline too. So massive thank you. And I'll see you soon, Tez. No doubt we'll catch up.
Thank
I'm going to go and rescue my mum now from the clutches of my little one. I'll see you soon.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Take care then.
For those of you that are still online with us, and currently on the course, so if you want more information about that, then just do get in touch with us. And like I said, you can do things like complete the Serious Youth Violence Scorecard, and that will also get you onto our mailing list. So when we're doing events and things of that nature, you can, you'll be the first to know. You'll be the first to know. So, you'll be the first to know when we launch masterclasses. We do have a few more coming up really shortly. And again, if you're interested in studying the course in its various different forms, if you want to, interested in doing that, then visit the website and drop an application in, and we will invite you to enroll the next time we open up for enrollment. We believe a new course probably will be starting around October. And then we also have our distance learning. So again, if this, being online with us, doesn't necessarily suit you or your current arrangements, then by all means you can study this program via our distance learning program also. So anything left to say, anybody, before we get out of here? It's 7:05. I am conscious of your time also. If there's nobody that has anything to say other than that, then we will just go ahead and sign out. So again, thank you for attending. Appreciate you joining us for our live session, our live working with gangs and serious youth violence session. For those of you that are here and on the course, I will see you next week. Everybody else, have a great rest of your week, and we'll catch you up really soon. Take care, everybody.
Are the slides going to be on the portal?
The what, sorry?
The slides.
Yeah, the slides are on the portal. They should already be on there.
Okay,
I did
great.
upload them. I uploaded them earlier today, so they're there.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Tia. Bye.